What's up guys, Sagi here, and welcome to another Tech Gear Talk. Today I'm going to tell you how Sigma rescued Canon. I was so excited when Sigma announced that they were going to release the 16, 30, and 56 f1.4 trio for the Canon EOS M. If you've been looking at Canon APS-C mirrorless cameras over the past few years, you've probably come across some criticism regarding the EF-M lens mount. Canon is in a little bit of a challenging situation now because they're trying to support 4 different lens systems. We've got the EFS lenses, which can be used on APS-C sensor DSLRs and Super 35 cinema cameras. We've got the EF lenses, which are designed for full frame sensors, and they'll still work on APS-C and cinema cameras. Now, we already mentioned the EF-M lenses, which are designed for APS-C mirrorless cameras, and then finally the new RF lenses, which are designed for the full-frame Canon mirrorless cameras. So needless to say, that's a lot. And the EF and EFS lines have been around for years, and there's tons of options at different budgets. But having all these different lines makes it difficult to create enough options for the newer mounts. Now, one of the major criticisms of the EF-M options from Canon is the lack of fast primes. And when I say fast, I don't mean the literal speed of the lens or the autofocus, I mean that it has a wide aperture. And the reason why these are called fast lenses is because the large aperture lets in more light and it allows you to shoot at faster shutter speeds. Now, if we're using the Efs Adapter, then we have a ton of options because we're looking at that super complete and very established lineup of lenses. And we can even use a speed booster like this one from Comlight to get close to full frame field of view and an additional stop of light when we use EF lenses on an EOS M body. Now, this is a super powerful option and I'll do a dedicated video about it very soon. But going back to fast native EF-M lenses, there just aren't a ton of options. So we currently have the 22mm f2 and the 32mm f1.4, both of which are wonderful lenses. In fact, that 32mm f1.4 is probably the best native EF-M lens Canon has on the market. But that's pretty much it, and this has been a deterrent for some potential buyers who have been considering the M50 or the M6 Mark II, both of which I really like. So to the rescue comes Sigma with 3 phenomenal, fast, sharp, and affordable lenses: the 16mm, the 30mm, and the 56mm f1.4. Let's start out by talking about the lens that I've been using a ton lately, the Sigma 16mm f1.4 DCDN, which sells for $399. This is an absolutely spectacular lens, and there's currently nothing from Canon that even comes close in terms of wide angle and speed. We're getting approximately a 26mm full frame equivalent field of view, and Canon's closest lens would be the 22mm f2, which is both slower and provides a tighter angle of view. This lens has a 67mm filtered thread, a minimum focus distance of 25 centimeters or 9.8 inches, and it uses 16 elements in 13 groups. It's super fast with a maximum aperture of f1.4 and a minimum aperture of f16. And when shooting at f1.4, this lens lets in a ton of light and provides a shallow depth of field. Now, this makes it an excellent lens to use in low light, and because it's so wide, it's also a fantastic vlogging lens. But more on this later. The 16mm is the largest of the 3 Sigma lenses, with a diameter of 72mm or 2.8 inches, a length of 92mm or 2.9 inches, and it weighs in at 405 grams or 14.8 ounces. Now, I've been using this lens a lot, as well as its Sony E-mount counterpart with the Sony a61, 64, and 6600. Now next, let's take a look at the Sigma 30mm f1.4 DCDN, which sells for $289. It's a pretty small lens at approximately 65mm or 2.8 inches in diameter, 73mm or 2.9 inches in length, and it weighs in at 256 grams or 9.35 ounces. It has a 52mm filtered thread, a minimum focus distance of 30 centimeters or 11.8 inches, and there are 9 elements in 7 groups. The Sigma 30mm is a direct competitor to Canon's 32mm f1.4. The Sigma is a bit bigger and heavier, and it has a farther minimum focus distance at 30 centimeters versus 23 centimeters on the Canon. Now, both lenses have a maximum aperture of f1.4 and a minimum aperture of f16, but the Sigma currently sells for $289 versus $479 for the Canon. And in my opinion, this lens is a steal. It will give you approximately a 48mm full-frame equivalent field of view, which is a great alternative to using a nifty 50 on a full-frame sensor camera. Next, let's look at the Sigma 56mm f1.4 DCDN, which at this point has no counterpart from Canon. The closest you can do to get a similar field of view and speed is to use an EF to EFM adapter, and then pick up one of the 50mm options from Canon, the f1.8, f1.4, or f1.2. As far as price goes, the Sigma 56 currently sells for $429, whereas the Canon 50mm f1.4 sells for $349, and the f1.8 sells for about $150. Now, of course, you'll also need an adapter, which is around $160 from Canon, and there are some less expensive third-party options. The 56 has a very slightly larger diameter than the 30mm, so we're looking at 67mm or 2.6 inches. It's noticeably shorter at only 60mm or 2.3 inches, and it weighs in at 280 grams or 9.9 ounces. The filter thread size is 55mm. We have 10 elements in 6 groups, and a minimum focus distance of 50 centimeters or 1.64 feet. Like with the other two lenses, we have an aperture range of f1.4 to f16, and overall this is a wonderful lens to use for portraits. We're getting approximately a 90mm full frame equivalent field of view, and with this longer focal length, it's going to give you very nice separation from the background because of the added compression, and it's tack sharp. Now before I move on to the next section, if you like what you've seen so far, let me know by giving this video a thumbs up. It helps me know what kind of content you like so that I can make more of it. And if this is your first time here, go ahead and hit the subscribe and notification buttons so you can stay up to date on the latest gear and tutorials. I've got some photo and video samples to show you, but first I just want to highlight a few of the things that the Sigma Trio have in common. First, they all have a super wide maximum aperture at f1.4, and this allows a lot of light to reach the sensor and makes all three excellent low light options. It's also going to give you very shallow depth of field, so you can separate your subject from the background. The bayonet mount is constructed from brass for a more secure fit and durable construction, and rubber sealing is incorporated in the mount design to make the lenses dust and splash resistant. All three lenses work beautifully with Canon's autofocus system. You can use servo AF with face and eye detection. For video, you can also get continuous autofocus, subject tracking, as well as face detections in cameras like the M50 and face and eye detection in something like the M6 Mark II. All three lenses come with hoods, which is an accessory that Canon charges you extra for, unless you're purchasing the higher end L series glass. And this may seem like a small thing, but personally I appreciate when a manufacturer includes these types of accessories rather than requiring an additional purchase. The Sigma lenses provide full EXIF info and come with built-in lens profiles which automatically activate your camera's lens aberration correction for both peripheral illumination and chromatic aberration. As with the Sony E-mount and the Micro Four Third versions of these lenses, we're not getting Sigma's OS or optical stabilization, but this is true for every other Canon EFM prime at this time, and since there's no M-mount cameras that offer IBIS or sensor shifting image stabilization, you'll need to rely on your camera's in-body digital image stabilization. If you're not sure what the difference is, I created a short video that explains it, and I'll link to it up in the corner and in the description. Moving on, I already mentioned full frame equivalent fields of view, but I want to give you a real-life representation of what that means. As you might already know, Canon's APS-C sensor has a 1.6x crop, meaning that in order to get the full frame equivalent, we need to take the focal length of the lens and multiply it by 1.6. This makes the 16mm a 25.6mm equivalent field of view, which again is nice and wide. This is a great option for street photography, landscape, architecture, real estate, and astrophotography. It's also a great vlogging lens, and I'll show you some samples later on in the video. The 30mm ends up being a 48mm equivalent, which makes it a nice all-purpose lens. It's a tighter angle of view than what we get with the 16mm, which ends up closely resembling what we see with our own eyes. Now, this generally creates photos with a natural and pleasing look. If you're starting out, you may also like this because as you look through the viewfinder, you're seeing the scene in a very familiar way, which could help you compose your shots. Now moving on to the 56, we're getting an 89.6 equivalent field of view, which in my opinion is an awesome focal length for portraits. When you photograph faces with wider angle lenses, you always need to be very careful about distortion. But with the longer focal length of the 56, you're good to go. So if you're gonna do a lot of portrait work, this is the one that you want. You also get fantastic compression and bokeh. Compression means that the background appears closer than it really is. And at the same time, it's nicely blurred, which creates wonderful separation. This short telephoto lens can also work well for you for sports photography, as long as you're not too far away from the action. All right, let's take a look at a few sample images to help us see the difference we get in terms of compression and bokeh with all three lenses at close to their minimum focus distance. Starting out with the 16mm, you can see that even with this wide angle lens, we're still getting wonderful separation and a shallow depth of field. Moving on to the 30mm, you can see that these effects are magnified. The background is more blurred out, the bokeh circles are larger and appear closer to the subject. Now finally with the 56, where once again, we see even larger bokeh circles and a buttery smooth background. Next, let's take a look at a few portraits. I'll start in the opposite order because I think the 56 is the best option for this purpose. It's really a lovely focal length, allowing you to nicely frame the subject while separating them from the background. Moving on to my second favorite focal length of the three for portraits, we have the 30mm, which as I mentioned is a 48mm equivalent. So essentially you're using a nifty 50. And we're getting a little more of the scene here and a little less separation, and I'd love to know in the comment section which focal length you prefer for portraits. And finally, we'll look at the 16mm. Now of course, we're getting a lot more of the scene and it helps provide more context for the shot. Now you will get some distortion at this focal length, so you need to be mindful of both your distance from the subject and your composition. What's really nice about this lens is that we're still able to generate some separation from the background and help pull the eye to our subject. Next, I want to take a look at the sharpness and detail of each lens. To help with that, I photographed the same scene with all three lenses, each starting at f1.4 all the way up to f16. I made sure to include a subject in the corner so that we have a point of reference that includes details. I expect essentially every lens to be sharp in the center, but where performance really stands out is in the corners. Let's start out with the widest lens, the 16mm, and we'll first look at f1.4. I was really impressed with what the lens delivered, even wide open. Now going to f2, we can see that the sharpness level increased all the way to the sweet spot being at around f4. Moving on to the 30mm, we're still getting good detail at f1.4. Closing down to f2, we can see the level of detail increase. And then once again, we're seeing the sweet spot at around f4. And finally, let's move on to the 56, which might be the sharpest of these three lenses. Even at f1.4, I can see a good level of detail even in the corner. And once again, as we expect when we move to f2, we're increasing this. And like with the other two, the sweet spot is right at around f4. Now I'm going to show you a focus test for stills. So I'm going to move from one subject to the next. I'm going to alternate back and forth with all three lenses and see how they perform. Starting out with the 16mm. Next, moving on to the 30mm. And then finally the 56. The next test I'm going to show you is for video, and I want to see how quickly and effectively the lenses pull focus with continuous autofocus. Once again, we're going to start with the 16mm. Move on to the 30mm. And then finally the 56. Next, let's look at vlogging, which is where the 16mm is an awesome focal length if you want to just handhold the camera using something like a GorillaPod. You can easily get yourself in the frame and you don't have to worry about cutting off your head. Here's a sample of me walking around holding the actual camera with my arm fully extended, which will give you an idea about the framing. And now I'm using a GorillaPod, and this gives me even more separation, but it's a little less sturdy. I want to reiterate that none of these lenses have optical image stabilization, and until Canon releases an M body with IBIS, we have to rely on digital image stabilization. Now, the angle of view of the 16mm does help in this case, because a wide-angle lens generally appears more stable. And let me know what you think about the results in the comments section. Is this usable footage for what you need? And of course, you can continue to stabilize this footage with your software if you think that it's necessary, using something like Adobe Premiere Pro's WRF Stabilizer. And finally, if you really want buttery smooth footage, go ahead and throw this setup on a gimbal and you're all set. Now here's some sample footage using the Zhiyun Weebill S, and I'll link to a complete review of this gimbal in case you want some more info. Next, I'm going to show you some samples of me moving around the frame, and I want you to pay attention to a few things. First, notice how the background changes as I move closer and farther away from the camera. And next, I want you to listen to the sound that the autofocus motor makes. I'm going to give you 2 tests for each lens, one using the built-in microphone and one using the Rode VideoMic Pro Plus mounted on the camera, so we can hear the difference. I do want to mention that I do everything that I can not to use the internal microphone on any of my cameras. And on top of that, most of the time, I'm using a microphone that is not mounted on the camera so that I don't have to worry about any sound coming from the lenses, and I can get the microphone closer to the source. I'll link up to a video in the corner and in the description that talks about why I do this and the importance of audio for video. All right, I'm going to start out with the 16mm, and I'm using the M50's internal microphone so that you can hear what the microphone is picking up in terms of autofocus when you're doing a talking head and the person is not really moving around all that much. All right, so now I'm doing the same thing, but using the Rode VideoMic Pro Plus. It's mounted right on top of the camera, so you can hear what type of audio it's picking up from the autofocus motor while someone is speaking. All right, now we're back to the internal microphone, and now I'm going to start moving around quite a bit, and I'm also going to use my hand to block the lens and make it focus on my hand. I want you to pay attention to 2 things. First, I want you to listen to the autofocus sounds, and second, I want you to see how the background changes as I get closer and farther away from the camera. And the last thing I'm going to do is again using the Rode VideoMic Pro Plus, but now I'm going to move back and forth. Make sure that you pay attention to the background and also listen to the autofocus motor. And let me know in the comment section if you can hear a difference between using the internal microphone and using an external microphone mounted on the camera. Next, we're going to move on to the 30mm. We're going to start with the same type of test. We're using the internal microphone on the M50, and I'm going to try to stay in one spot and not move around too much and let you hear what the internal microphone is picking up in terms of autofocus motor sounds. And I'm going to do the same thing using the Rode VideoMic Pro Plus mounted on the M50. I'm going to stay pretty still so that we can see whether you can actually hear the autofocus motor while someone is speaking and you're using an external microphone. Now we're back to the internal microphone. I'm going to move around quite a bit, make the autofocus motor work, and I want you to both listen and watch the background change. And the last test with the 30mm is again using the Rode VideoMic Pro Plus. Pay attention both to the sound and how the visual relationship between me and the background changes. Alright, and now we're going to do this same set of tests with the 56mm. We're going to start out with the talking head without a ton of movement, and we'll see whether the internal microphone picks up any of the autofocus motor sounds. And now I'm doing the same thing using the 56 and the Rode VideoMic Pro Plus mounted on the camera. I'm pretty far away from the camera, so I'm not sure what the audio quality sounds like, but I just wanted to see whether the microphone is going to pick up any of the autofocus motor sounds. Now we're back to the internal microphone, and I'm going to move around and see if we can pick up any audio using the internal microphone. And the last test for today will be the 56 Rode VideoMic Pro Plus, and then me moving around to really make the autofocus motor work hard. I know I mentioned that it's extremely rare that I use the internal microphone on the camera, but I wanted you to hear the difference so that you can make an educated decision about whether getting an external microphone makes enough of a difference for what you need. So like I said in the beginning, I was so excited when Sigma announced this trio was being released for the EOS M. And now that I've had a chance to use them, I can say that I would definitely pick up the 16 and the 56mm. And if it's in your budget, go ahead and grab the 30 as well. You'll have a great range of small and portable but fast and sharp prime lenses, which cover a pretty significant range. All three lenses offer great values and are at a very affordable price point. I'll put links in the description to all the items I talked about in this video, and if you buy those items or anything else using those links, you help support my channel for free and allow me to create more content, so thank you in advance. Ultimately, it's not important for me that you use the same gear that I do. I just want you to use whatever gear works well for you. I really hope I was able to give you a good overview of the 16, 30, and 56mm f1.4 DCD-N lenses. If I did, please let me know by giving this video a thumbs up, tweet it, share it, and if you haven't yet, join the community by hitting the subscribe and notification buttons. You can also find me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Tech Gear Talk. You know what I always say, buy it nice or buy it twice. Good luck and see you soon.